The clinking of champagne glasses sounded like 1,000 tiny bells, each one ringing in a new moment of my personal hell. I watched my father, Robert, a retired Navy captain who still wore his authority like a second skin, as he took center stage at the reception. He raised his glass, a practiced smile on his face, and began his toast. He spoke of my brother, Alex the groom, as the proud continuation of a legacy I was apparently never meant to be a part of. Then, his eyes found me, and the smile tightened into something crueler. "And here's to my lazy, worthless girl," he boomed, the old family joke landing with a thud. A few of his friends chuckled, the sound echoing the polite, pained laughter I'd heard my entire life. I just sat there, my posture perfect, my expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. In that moment, I saw every dismissive pat on the head, every time my achievements were brushed aside for one of Alex's minor victories. Then, a new sound cut through the room. Silence. Absolute deafening silence. I saw the groomsmen's table. 4 men, their backs ramrod straight. They weren't laughing. One of them, a man I knew as Sergeant Miller, spoke with a voice that was calm, clear, and carried the weight of irrefutable fact. "Sir, with all due respect, you're talking about our commanding officer." My father's smile shattered. The glass in his hand began to tremble, the expensive champagne sloshing over the rim as the entire room turned to stare at me. The man who saw me as nothing was now faced with a truth he couldn't comprehend. It all started 2 weeks earlier, on a secure video call. I was in a sterile, windowless room, the kind that becomes your whole world when a mission is active. On the screen were my father and Alex, planning the wedding from the comfort of our family home. I had to tell them. I may be a few hours late to the rehearsal dinner. I have a critical pre-to-deployment briefing that can't be moved. My father scoffed, a familiar sound of grinding disappointment. "A briefing? Eva, for God's sake, it's a PowerPoint presentation. Your brother's wedding is a legacy event. Your little admin job can wait." My little admin job. Alex, ever the dutiful son, just nodded along. "Yeah, sis, it's just one night." The words landed like stones, each one a reminder of my place, my life's work, the sleepless nights, the immense responsibility, the lives that depended on my judgment, was reduced to a nuisance, an inconvenient hobby that was getting in the way of a party. A cold, quiet fury began to build inside me, solidifying into a hard, clear resolution. They wanted me to be small, so I would let them think I was. He called it an admin job. He had no idea my admin job involved authorizing the deployment of the very men standing next to his son at the altar. To understand the reckoning that followed, you have to understand the uniform I wore when he wasn't looking. To exist in my family was to live 2 completely separate lives. In one, I was just Eva, the quiet daughter, a placeholder in family photos. In the other, I was Major Rostova, a call sign, an officer whose decisions had consequences that rippled across continents. The disconnect was a constant humming dissonance in the back of my mind, a gap that had been carved out years ago and only grown wider over time. I remember the day the chasm truly formed, the day of my brother Alex's commissioning ceremony. The sun was brilliant, glinting off the polished brass and the stark white uniforms. My father, Robert, was practically glowing, his pride a physical force. He stood before Alex, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of legacy, of service, of a son following in his father's footsteps on the sea. I watched as he carefully pinned the lieutenant's bars on my brother's shoulders, not just as a father, but as a superior officer passing down a sacred mantle. I was proud of Alex, I truly was. But a familiar coldness seeped into my bones. I was standing right there, but I was transparent. It wasn't a celebration of his children serving, it was a celebration of the one child who served in the right way, in the right uniform. I was just a spectator to my own family's history being written. A few years later, I had my own moment of triumph. I graduated from the Army's Advanced Military Intelligence course, a grueling program that had a nearly 50% attrition rate. I didn't just pass, I finished top of my class. There was no parade, no crisp uniform ceremony, just a certificate and a deep, burning sense of accomplishment. I stepped outside the drab institutional building and called home, my heart pounding with a nervous excitement I hadn't felt in years. I wanted just once for him to hear the pride in my voice and match it with his own. He picked up on the third ring. I could hear the blare of a cable news channel in the background. "Dad, I did it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I graduated today. I was the distinguished honor grad." There was a pause, and for a heartbeat I allowed myself to hope. Then he replied, his voice distracted. "Oh, that computer stuff? That's great, honey. Very practical." I could feel the hope wither and die. Before I could even respond, he continued, his tone suddenly animated. "Now listen, your brother's ship just docked in Spain. He sent us pictures, the view is incredible." The rest of the conversation was a blur of Alex's adventures. I hung up the phone and stood there in the quiet parking lot, the heavy certificate in my hand feeling like nothing more than a piece of paper. That was the world he saw. Now, let me tell you about the world he didn't. Fast forward to 3 weeks before the wedding, in the dead of night. I was in a skiff, a sensitive compartmented information facility. The only light came from a wall of monitors displaying satellite feeds and cascading lines of code. The air was cold, smelling of filtered air and hot electronics. This was my office. I was standing at the head of a large table, briefing my team on a crisis. "Operation Nightshade is compromised," I said, my voice low and even. "We have an asset in danger. We need to initiate the silent exit protocol, effective immediately." The men in that room, the same men who would later be my brother's groomsmen, were a blur of focused professional energy. There was no hesitation, only execution. "Ma'am, what are your orders for surveillance?" Sergeant Miller asked. I pointed to a grid on the main screen. "I want all available SIGINT focused on these grids, and I need the Joint STARS feed rerouted to my terminal now. We are this asset's only way out." My commander, General Hale, a man who judged people by their results and nothing else, was observing via a secure video link. I laid out the plan, the contingencies, the risks. When I was done, a heavy silence filled the room as my team began their work. On the screen, the general simply gave a short, sharp nod. That single nod was more validation than my father had given me in 20 years. My father's ideology was the root of it all. He was a man obsessed with a specific, outdated vision of military glory he'd inherited from the Cold War. To him, power was a battleship cutting through the waves or a fighter jet screaming across the sky, things you could see and touch. The Navy was the tip of the spear. My career in Army intelligence, a world of shadows, data, and human intelligence, was incomprehensible to him. It was a glorified desk job, something he once condescendingly called a fine career for a woman in the rear with the gear. He'd lecture me at holiday dinners, as if explaining a complex theory to a child. "Alex is on a warship, Ava," he'd say, polishing his glasses. "He is projecting American power. You're doing the paperwork that supports the spear. Both are important, I suppose." He supposed. He genuinely believed I spent my days in a cubicle, alphabetizing files, completely oblivious to the fact that the intelligence my paperwork produced was what aimed that spear in the first place. He saw a clerk when in reality, I was the one drawing the map. This was the duality I lived with. A footnote in my family story, but the author of the one that truly mattered. For years, I fought to be seen in his world, a world defined by steel ships and loud cannons. I finally realized I didn't need his validation. I just needed him to attend one meeting in mine. After that video call ended, I sat in the humming silence of the secure room for a long time. The anger was gone. The familiar sting of being dismissed had faded, and in its place was something new, something cold, quiet, and intensely clear. For years I had tried to fight my family's narrative with emotional appeals, with desperate attempts to explain the gravity of my work, and with the childish hope that one day they would simply see me. That fight was over. I was done trying to speak their language of feelings and favoritism. A decision settled over me, not with a crash, but with the quiet finality of a classified document being stamped. The wedding would no longer be just a family event. It would be a venue for a formal correction of the record, executed with military precision. A few days later, an email from my brother Alex arrived. The subject line was Groomsmen list, and the message was breezy. "Hey sis, here are the guys. They're all army, you'll probably have a lot to talk about." I could almost hear his patronizing tone, as if he were setting up a playdate for his socially awkward sister. I felt a flicker of the old irritation, but I pushed it down. This was no longer about emotion. This was about intelligence gathering. I took the list of 4 names to my terminal, my fingers moving deliberately across the keyboard as I ran them through the secure personnel database. The system processed the query, and the results loaded on the screen. And then I saw it. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. They weren't just army guys. They were the key non-commissioned officers and technical specialists from the Special Mission Unit currently under my direct command, Task Force Sentinel. To my brother, they were his buddies. To me, they were my team. To them, I wasn't Eva. I was Major Rostova. Or, more often, just a voice on a secure line, the unseen authority known only by my call sign, Oracle. The beauty of the plan was that it required almost no action. My strategy was inaction. My greatest asset was my family's complete and utter ignorance, an ignorance they had so carefully cultivated over the years. I wouldn't need to say a word to Alex or my father. I would simply allow them to walk into a situation where the rules were not written by my father's ego, but by the rigid, unbending structure of the United States Army. Protocol would be the weapon, and their arrogance would pull the trigger. My only deliberate choice? I would wear civilian clothes to the wedding. My authority wasn't something I pinned to my chest, it was who I was. My father believed power was announced with a cannon blast. I was taught that true power is the information no one knows you have. The guests were arriving. The orchestra was playing. And my father had no idea he was about to be debriefed. The wedding reception was a masterpiece of my father's design, a grand ballroom, with towering floral arrangements and the warm glow of chandeliers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, a soundtrack for a perfect life I had no part in composing. My brother Alex and his new bride drifted through the room, bathed in the adoration of their guests, completely oblivious to the storm that was gathering. I sat at my designated table, a quiet island of calm observation, nursing a glass of water. Across the room, my father, Robert, was in his element. He held his champagne flute like a scepter, regaling his old Navy buddies with stories of his service, his voice a familiar, booming testament to his own perceived greatness. He was the king in his court, the proud patriarch presiding over his legacy. Eventually, the clinking of a fork against a glass silenced the room. It was time for the toast. My father strode to the microphone with the confident gait of a man who owned the world, or at least this small corner of it. He began by praising Alex, his voice swelling with pride as he spoke. Of my brother's naval career, his accomplishments, his bright future. It was the same speech I'd been hearing my whole life, the grand narrative of the Rostova men, the inheritors of honor and duty. I felt a familiar, weary resignation settle over me. I had heard all the chapters of this story before, and I knew my part was to be the footnote at the end. And then, as expected, he turned to me. A smirk played on his lips. "And I have to thank my daughter," he announced, his voice dripping with condescending humor, "for processing the vacation forms to be here tonight." A wave of polite laughter rippled through his side of the room. It was the laugh of people who had heard this joke, or ones like it, for years. He let the laughter build before raising his glass high, a showman playing to his crowd. "Here's to my lazy, worthless girl. May she one day find a husband as successful as this one." It wasn't just an insult, it was a public execution of my worth, delivered with a smile. The laughter this time was more uncomfortable, mingled with pitying glances in my direction. I didn't flinch. I simply watched him, my face a placid mask, and I thought to myself, this is it. This is the man you've spent your life trying to please. As the painful echoes of laughter died down, a new sound emerged. Click. It was the sound of 4 heavy glasses being set down on a table, not carelessly, but with sharp, unified precision. A sudden, deep silence fell over the reception hall. Everyone turned toward the groomsmen's table. Sergeant Miller, the senior NCO of my team, rose to his feet. He wasn't angry. He was perfectly, unnervingly calm. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the unmistakable tone of a formal report cutting through the thick tension like a scalpel. "Sir," he said, his eyes locked on my father. "With all due respect, you're talking about our commanding officer." The silence that followed was no longer just quiet, it was a physical weight. My father froze, the smug smile melting from his face, replaced by a look of pure, baffled indignation. He sputtered, his voice suddenly weak. "Her? She's your... what?" He looked at me as if seeing a ghost. Another groomsman, our communications specialist, stood up beside Miller. "Major Rostova is Oracle, sir," he stated, his voice flat and factual. "She's the CO for Operation Nightshade." The words hung in the air. Operation Nightshade, a name that meant nothing to most, but to the few in the know, it was a whisper. Of classified reports, of immense authority, of life and death decisions made in the shadows. Then came the moment that shattered his world. As one, the four men pivoted on their heels to face me directly. In a single, fluid motion, they snapped to the crisp, unbending position. Of attention, their posture a textbook illustration of military deference. Their heels clicked on the polished floor, a sound as final and absolute as a gavel strike. Sergeant Miller's voice was sharp, a clear report that resonated in the silent hall. "Ma'am?" It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of rank that transformed the opulent ballroom into a formal military setting. In that single word, my father's reality was dismantled. His face, which had been flushed with pride and alcohol, drained of all color, leaving behind a pale, waxy mask of horror. He, a retired Navy captain, understood the language of rank and protocol better than anyone. He understood the profound, inviolable meaning of that gesture. He was witnessing 4 combat-hardened soldiers showing absolute reflexive deference to the daughter he had just publicly branded as worthless. The power dynamic of his entire universe, the one in which he was the patriarch, the commander, the king, had just been inverted with a single word and a posture of respect he could never command from them. He stumbled back a step, a choked gasp escaping his lips. His hand trembled so violently that his champagne glass slipped, crashing to the floor. In a symphony of destruction that was nothing compared to the ruin on his face, my father had spent his life collecting medals to hang on a wall. In that moment he realized my authority wasn't something you could polish and display, it was something you commanded in silence. The crash of my father's champagne glass was the last loud noise of the evening. After that, a profound and unsettling quiet settled over our part of the room. The toast was over. My father, Robert, didn't say another word. He simply collapsed into his chair, his face a gray, slack mask of a man whose entire world had been pulled out from under him. He was a king whose castle had just been revealed to be made of sand, and he was left staring at the tide. The wedding continued around us. The band started playing again. People began to dance. But a bubble of cold, shocked silence had formed around my family. I was now the center of a new and unnerving gravity. Guests no longer gave me looks of pity, they whispered as I passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. My brother, Alex, eventually approached me, his own face a portrait of bewilderment. He looked as though he was seeing me for the first time, and the picture didn't make any sense to him. "Eva, what is Oracle?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a lifetime of questions packed into those 3 words, a lifetime of willful ignorance now crashing down upon him. I looked at my brother, the golden boy, the center of our family's universe, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. "It's my job, Alex," I said simply. There was nothing else to say. How could I possibly explain my world to someone who had never even bothered to look past the front door? Throughout the night, my men, the groomsmen, formed a subtle protective circle around me. They talked to me about mundane things, deployment schedules and equipment, requisitions, but their presence was a solid, reassuring wall of respect. They were my people. This was my world. My biological family had never felt more distant. 1 year later, the world had shifted on its axis. I stood before a massive wall-sized digital map in a command center, a silver oak leaf now pinned to my uniform. I was Lieutenant Colonel Rostova. I was briefing my former commander, General Hale, and a host of other senior officers on a new intelligence directorate, my intelligence directorate. My voice was confident, my command of the material absolute, as I detailed operational parameters and strategic objectives. The promotion wasn't just a step up, it was a recognition of the success of missions like Operation Nightshade. The wedding felt like a lifetime ago, a strange fever dream that had broken and left the world clearer than before. It was a moment of personal vindication, yes, but it had also become a footnote in a much larger story of professional ascent. My real family was forged in rooms like this one. After the briefing, my old team, including a newly promoted staff, Sergeant Miller, ambushed me with a cake and some terrible coffee. We stood around the conference table, laughing and trading stories. The camaraderie was easy, built on a foundation of shared purpose and the kind of deep, mutual respect that comes from trusting someone with your life. There were no mind games here, no battles for approval, no conditional love. This was a family built on competence, not blood and obligation. They saw me for exactly who I was and what I could do, and it was all that ever mattered. The quiet, supportive celebration in that sterile room felt more real and more loving than any loud, performative family gathering I had ever endured. Late one night, weeks later, I was sitting alone in my new office, reviewing after-action reports. The base outside my window was quiet, a city of disciplined purpose at rest. A small notification popped up on my personal laptop. It was an email. The subject line was just my name, Eva. My heart gave a single hard thump. It was from my father. I clicked it open, a strange sense of clinical detachment washing over me. The message was short, the words seemingly chosen with a difficulty he had never shown in his life. "I've been reading the declassified public reports about Operation Nightshade," he wrote. "I had no idea. The legacy I was so proud of. It's nothing compared to the one you're building. I am sorry." I read the email twice. The words I had once desperately craved, the apology I thought would heal everything, were finally there, glowing on the screen. A younger version of me would have wept with relief. But I felt nothing. No, that's not true. I felt a quiet, somber peace. His validation had finally arrived, but the package was delivered to an address I no longer lived at. My worth was no longer a question that needed his answer. His apology wasn't for me, it was for him. It was the final entry in a ledger that no longer mattered. I took a long, slow breath, a final exhale of a lifetime of expectation. My cursor hovered over the screen. My choice is clear: reply, delete, archive. I clicked archive. My father believed a legacy was something you inherit. I learned a true legacy is something you build in silence and have acknowledged in public. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.